Good morning. 早上好，大家好. This morning plenary will deal with the critical developments in geopolitics and geoeconomics and deal with the questions on everyone's minds. We are going through a very special time in history, a sensitive time, and in fact, a dangerous time. We have transited from a bipolar world during the Cold War to a unipolar world, and now we are transiting to a multipolar world. But in this multipolar world, we see that many of the institutions we were familiar with for 80 years in the liberal world order is fast being undermined and dismantled, and strangely, by the country that led its establishment and development. What are we transiting through? What are we transiting to? And in this new era, are we going to see a situation where might becomes right? Now, with me to discuss these interesting topics are six excellent speakers. They have not been introduced, so let me very quickly tell you who they are because I think you have not yet had a chance to look at their bio. Let me begin with Ryan first. Ryan Haas, director of the John Taunton China Center at Brookings Institution, Washington, D.C. He was in the Obama White House, and he served in the Beijing embassy some years ago. Next to him is Professor Liu Yuanchun, who is a very well-known economist. I learned that he is considered the most influential economist by China Newsweek in 2022 and voted one of the 10 most influential economists in China by Sina Finance. And he heads, of course, he's president of the Shanghai University of Finance and Economics. And next to him is Kwon Ping, Singaporean, extraordinary entrepreneur, an intellectual entrepreneur who knows how to make money too. He is chairman of the Banyan Group, and he sat on the boards of GIC, Singapore Airlines, Singapore Chartered Bank, and Diageo. It's a spirits and alcohol company. Yeah, alcohol, yeah. And I'm pleased to introduce Ambassador Liu Zhenmin, China's Special Envoy for Climate Change, a former UN Undersecretary and Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs, China. And next to him is Gita Wirjawan, former founder and chairman of Ancora Group and Minister of Trade of Indonesia previously, and also chairman of Indonesia's Investment Coordinating Board. And last but not least, Alfred Schipke, who is the director of the East Asia Institute in NUS. He was previously IMF's senior resident representative in China for at least 5 years, I believe. So here's the panel, and they are here to discuss this very interesting time of flux with you. The format is the following. I have 80 minutes. We'll spend about 55, 60 minutes talking amongst ourselves. You are encouraged, panelists, to disagree with each other. That makes it more interesting. And then the remaining 10 minutes will be for the audience to pose questions to them. So let me begin by asking each of them to give me a 5-minute take, their take, on what they see. There is general recognition that this is a multipolar world today. So what is the nature of this multipolarity? And is this a good thing or a bad thing for the world in terms of prosperity, peace, and security? Ryan.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. It's really a pleasure to be among all these friends. I come from Washington, D.C. I'm a somewhat traditional American foreign policy analyst in the sense that I think that alliances add value and strength to the United States, that the existing rules-based international order strengthens America's influence in the world. President Trump is not a traditional foreign policy thinker. He's an unconventional, non-traditional foreign policy thinker. He thinks that these things drain America's strength and America's resources, and that the United States needs to stop taking on other people's problems, not burden share, but burden shift, so that other countries can tackle their own challenges and the United States can get back in the business of putting America first. That is sort of the core of his argument, that America has so many challenges at home that it needs to focus its resources, its attention, its energy upon itself. Now, the challenge with this is that the world does not naturally order itself. Countries do not naturally provide global public goods. And if there is not a strong country that serves as a convening power, that brings countries together in service of common goals, then things naturally fray. And at the moment, there is no other country in the world that appears willing, able, or capable of playing that role. And so this is sort of the crux of the challenge that I see, particularly given the fact that so many of the world's challenges transcend borders. They're not just confined to one country or one region. And, ultimately, I think that what we're entering is a more disordered, more chaotic world, a world where there is selfish pursuit of national interest, and where countries work very hard to try to protect themselves from external challenges entering into their country. And that's where we are at the moment, I think.
Thank you. Ryan, you kept to time. Professor.
我想给大家分享2个观点。第一个观点就是，我们从单极世界向多极世界转换，与以往的这种大周期不一样的是，这一次转换的主体是上一个我们讲的自由世界构建者认为，他在这样的一种全球化、垂直分工的全球化体系里面，他是受损者，因此他想改变规则，形成新一套体系。所以说，建造者成为了改革者，所以因此它的性质与我们以往讲的新的革命者的出现所打破的这种秩序不一样。这是我们要看到的第一个，就是多极化不能够简单的来概括目前以美国为主体的对秩序的重构。第二个观点就是 ChatGPT 的出现，实际上是我们通常所讲的多极化向两极化进行进展。原因很重要，第4次科技与产业革命使很多新的产业、新的技术的竞争归结到这种超级研发能力、超级基础设施、超级投资能力和超级市场大国之间的这种竞争，它使小国在这场竞争中间 out 了，就说靠边站了。那么因此，我们简单的用经济比重的多元化来形容未来20年的竞争和世界发展格局，可能存在问题。也就是说，我们经常讲的技术周期所带来的市场体系的变化，一定会有它的新的一种模式，与我们简单想的从一个单极化世界、自由化世界向多极化世界转变的这个过程中间，会呈现出新的一些特征。这就是我跟大家首先分享的2个观点。谢谢。
Kwon Ping?
Well, Heng, since you invited us to disagree with each other, could I start by saying I somewhat disagree with the whole proposition. I think the idea of moving from a unipolar world to a multipolar world is rooted in Cold War typologies. It presupposes that there is a single power which is still very wholesome and powerful and giving way to others I think the world is actually far different from that today. I think we are seeing, and particularly since the topic is future China, even though it's organized by Business China, I think the future is not just a multipolar world. I think it's an entire paradigm shift to a very fundamental civilizational reset, where the Western civilization, which has been dominant for the last 300 years, is being challenged internally to its core. I do not think Western civilization, including both Europe and America, has had as serious an internal crisis as it has today in the last 100 years, since the 1930s. And the parallels between America today and the 1930s is tremendous. You talk to any of your intellectual friends in America today, the whole idea that within 1 year, all the civil institutions that make up civil society, and you look at even Europe, the entire ideology of democratic liberalism is being challenged to its core. So I think there's a paradigm shift, because on one hand you're seeing, I wouldn't call it decline, but I would certainly say there is a massive civilizational crisis in the West today, from its fundamental political values to its economic and military power. I think very honest intellectuals in the West would acknowledge it itself. That is on one hand. So it's not a unipolar, powerful America confronting a morally bankrupt Soviet Union that only happened to have military power. It's not that scenario. It's not a Cold War scenario. So you have one civilization that is in crisis. You have the rise of East Asian civilization, particularly in China, that is, again, I don't want to use the word multipolar, because that is playing to the idea that China's military is going to confront America's military, China's economy is going to confront America. This whole trap of win-lose, which I think is a mindset we should get ourselves out of. I think the civilizational challenge of China today is entirely not just economic or military, but in all its values. The values of political governance and responsibility for people. Every value that the Chinese civilization has had is rising up. So there's a complete paradigm shift. And I think this means that we need to look at it, if it's going to be a civilizational reset, we cannot look at it from the Western point of view that China is challenging America. China is clearly becoming ascendant, but it's not necessarily a challenge. I think one best way to look at this issue about a civilizational reset was when I read recently about a Chinese academic talking about AI in China and the challenge that the Chinese will have with AI. And again, it gave me an insight, because it was not so much about Chinese DeepSeek going to beat, open AI and so on. It was the idea that if China's civilization is going to rise and come into its own, the knowledge feed that goes into AI has been predominantly Western, not good or bad. It's just that all knowledge creation has been Western, because AI trains from the internet. So the whole thesis was, if there's going to be a civilizational reset, and we look at AI in terms of its analysis of politics, what about Chinese sources of knowledge? What about Kongzi, Mengzi, and all the Chinese philosophers of political science? You would not get that on the internet today. What about if you look at AI's probing into medicine? It's all Western medicine. What about the need for Chinese traditional medicine to actually be a knowledge feed for AI? So that gave me an insight that what we're talking about today as a civilizational reset is much more than about business, military, and this whole Cold War scenario that, China is going to overtake America, or America will not allow China to overtake it. That is playing to a mindset that I think is outmoded, and we need to think of a new paradigm shift of civilizational change, and very importantly, a civilizational reset. We can no longer think like we do in Singapore. Although we're bilingual, we are very much part of a Western civilizational mindset. And if we're going to, and if Singapore is going to play a bridging role, we have to understand that it's more than just about business, tariffs, and all of that.
Thank you, Kwon Ping. Actually, I would like to expand on it, but I would let the other speakers go first. You know, frankly, what you say, civilizational change of the paradigm with this civilizational new focus is not contrary to this multipolarity that is being shaped, because you have just described the nature of the multipolarity you see. And by the way, it's not just one civilization. There's several civilizations in Global South. Yeah, but let's carry on first. Ambassador Liu?
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Tang and dear fellow panelists. I'm very honored to join you for this very interesting discussion. I think on the question to be raised by our moderator, Ambassador Tang, to be very simple, I think that we are living in an evolving multipolar world. But let me explain or clarify a few points in this respect. First, from the Westphalia in 1648 until the end of the Second War and the founding of the United Nations, during that 297 years, there's no real world order. The order was the European order. The world was dominated by the European civilization. So US supported the creation of the League of Nations, but they did not join. So the US started to, for a long time, US followed the so-called Monroe Doctrine. So US started to engage in the Second World War in December 1941. And the US led the creation of the United Nations and the creation of the contemporary international order, together with other P4, that be China, France, former Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom. And now we are still living in that international order, but I think the fundamental change will be with the decolonization. This world order be now enjoyed by the 193 all members of the UN. It's a universal international order. But over the past 80 years, we have experienced three periods. So until the end of the Cold War in 1990 or 1992, the world was divided into two pillars, two polars. Bipolar world, the Cold War period, led by US and the former Soviet Union. Then, with the end of the Cold War, the world got to the period of I don't agree with the unipolar world. There's never no unipolar world. Get in the world with in Chinese we call it 一超多强. It is the superpower plus another major powers, other major powers, including China, Russia, European Union, and other major powers, including Japan, India, and other major powers. So this is the period. But since 2008, the international financial crisis happened in the United States from Wall Street. The US government started to realize that this world they cannot resolve by themselves. The main issues of international financial crisis, they cannot resolve by themselves. So they decided, okay, they need to extend this club to others, go beyond the G7. That's why they created this G20 summit. So for the past years, I characterized that maybe the multipolar world started with the creation of a G20 summit. But we have not really achieved so-called multipolar world, but we're still evolving. But now the world challenging the leader founder of this international order, the United States, started to destroy this order itself. Of course, I don't think it is supported by all American citizens. I think by a group of people in the US. But I think that the world need to be patient, give our US colleagues time to realize that destroying this current order is not in their own interest. They remain as a major power. US remains a major power, but they need to start to respect and live together in peace with other powers. I think in this multipolar world, evolving or growing multipolar world, of course, US, China, Russia, and the European Union will be the four major players. So the interrelationship among these four major players will determine the future of the world. But I can frankly to see there be no better structure can be created without agreement of these major powers. So we need to, I'm encouraging these major powers, especially European Union, United States and European Union, need to learn that changing their traditional mentality, that they can no longer dominate the world, but they need to learn from others. President Xi Jinping really initiated the 3 principles with the President Trump and with President Biden, that between U.S. China, that China prefers that we need to follow principle mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation. 3 principles. I think the 3 principles also apply to all the major power relationship. So I'm confident that this world will continue remain in a multipolar world, but we need to patiently help the major powers build up their confidence. Most important, to avoid the conflict. Avoid conflict. The world cannot suffer another Ukrainian war. The world cannot suffer another Middle East conflict. World needs peace. Needs peace. I think I'm confident for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Gita?
Sure. Ever since the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, I think it's almost a given that the United States, and to some extent other members of the West, have been on this general trend of having embarked on an ill campaign to spread liberal values all across the world, most particularly members of the Global South. And this would have been filled with distortions and to some extent hypocrisy, as if they're in this perennial state of being able to write and rewrite history. And this does not resonate well to most members of the Global South, to the extent that revisionism has been inevitable, coming from members of BRICS, ostensibly pioneered by China, and other members of the Global South. The appeal of this revisionism is ever increasing to members of the Global South. I speak for a Global South member called Indonesia, and I also speak for most members of Southeast Asia, which earn less than $13,205 per capita per year. That's the threshold for modernity. On the back of all this, I'm in a camp that believes that in spite of the revisionism, I think China and the West, particularly the US, are likely to become indispensable inevitabilities for the next 50 to 100 years. And that is good for Southeast Asia, because those are well-needed countervailing forces as to provide the well-needed peace and stability for Southeast Asia, as opposed to what we experienced in the 17th century on the back of that absence of countervailing force from China, which resulted in the 3.5 centuries of humiliation in most parts of Southeast Asia. Going forward, I think there are structural challenges with respect to Southeast Asia. If you take a look at the longitudinal poles of Southeast Asia from Nanway to Merauke, Nokmong to Boa, longitudinally 5,000 kilometers, latitudinally 4,000 kilometers. Those are equivalent to the distances of Los Angeles to Boston, Tehran to London. Despite the immensity and diversity of Southeast Asia, we're oftentimes identified as not great storytellers. We don't tell stories as well as we should. And this is empirically evidenced in that there's only about 375,000 books written about Southeast Asia in the context of about 140 million books. That's 0.26% of all publications available. For a region that represents about 700 million, equivalent to about 9% of the global population. So the challenge going forward is, how does Southeast Asia improve upon its pre-existing cognitive capacity? I think the structural reason as to why there is a widening economic divergence in Southeast Asia is largely and structurally because of the educational divergence within Southeast Asia. You just take a look at the PISA scores of Southeast Asian countries. Singapore is at the top of the world, top Southeast Asia. Vietnam is number 2 in Southeast Asia, has surpassed the global average, whereas the other 8 countries in Southeast Asia are still below the global average. You take a look at the tertiary education. There's 8,000 universities in Southeast Asia with 19 million students, whereas 2,600 universities in China with 39 million students. Only one university in Southeast Asia places in the top 20. So from a non-tertiary and tertiary standpoint, there is ostensible divergence. This is correlated with the economic divergence that's staring at us. Now, this is a structural challenge, particularly in the context of evolutionary processes as they relate to geopolitics, economics, technology, and climate. To the extent that the evolution is and likely to become more exponential, the more Southeast Asia needs to be more cohesive and collective. The more Southeast Asia needs to work on reducing the educational divergence as to reduce the economic divergence. The future for Southeast Asia, in my view, is to look at China, in spite of the massive economic relations, more for technological allocation purposes. Because Chinese technology is a lot more efficient, a lot cheaper. People in Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar, they cannot afford iPhones. They can only afford Huawei's and Oppo's. Singaporeans can afford iPhones because they earn $91,000 per capita per year, whereas the people in Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos, they earn less than $2,000 per year, whereas those in Indonesia only earn $5,000 per year. On the back of that, in addition to looking at China increasingly for technological capital allocation purposes, I think the West is a natural economic capital allocator by way of the fact that they've quantitatively eased their economies as to create about $140 trillion worth of liquidity that hasn't gotten diversified out to the global South. Why? Because of two structural attributes. The first is the lack of rule of law, which Singapore has, which most members of the global South do not have. The second is the lack of wherewithal to translate uncertainties into risks. Uncertainties are unknown unknowns, whereas risks are known unknowns. Stuff that can be priced, measured, quantified, and predicted. So I do see trends which are presenting both challenges and opportunities, but I do believe that Southeast Asia has its work cut out in the next few decades on the back of this massive educational divergence.
Thank you very much, Gita. Thank you for bringing in the inequalities in the world and largely in Global South in our development. When we talk of multipolarity, I think looking at inequalities within society and between countries is also a very important dimension. Alfred.
Thank you very much. Real pleasure to be here with the panelists. I want to focus a little bit on the econ and business part and start out with a suggestion that we need to be careful not to think too aspirational because the world has substantially changed. And the way I think about it is the following, and I'm guilty as charged. We used to have a global governance structure, call it trade structure, driven by the WTO, and somewhat we're here, it's kind of tough to do when, with the microphone, we're kind of moving away from what we used to know. But I think a lot of us still believe there's a rubber band between where we are and where we used to be, and I think we're hopeful that eventually we're going to come back to the world that we used to know. I would argue that the likelihood that we're going to come back to that world, even in a reformed fashion, is very unlikely. So we have to think about what happens if we cut that rubber band between where we are and where we want to be. Now that creates a lot of challenges, but it also creates opportunities, including for the business world. What is it that we're seeing right now? I'll give you two scenarios, one that we're currently seeing and one that maybe we should move toward. I think there are a lot of incentives for countries now to accelerate discussions on reducing trade barriers. It is done on a bilateral level. Europe, Indonesia, for example, is a good example. China and ASEAN. As a matter of fact, we are experiencing countries that have been stuck in negotiations now making concerted efforts to reduce trade barriers and non-trade barriers. However, it is done more or less at a bilateral level. And so we're going to have a spaghetti bowl of free trade agreements. Where should we move toward? This is my preferred scenario. If you take ASEAN, China, or Asia in general, and you look at another part of the world that has really benefited from globalization, which one is that? Europe. You take those two combined, both have high incentives to maintaining the core elements of the previous world. You have about 450 million Europeans, and if you come to this part of the world and only look at the middle class that is rising rapidly, we have about 200 million in ASEAN, we have about 400 million in China, that's already 600 million. That is a major block. The question is, would it be possible to foster the dialogue between these two groupings, whether it is in the context of RCEP or CPTPP? Of course, the key is to have China included in this. But if one were to move in that direction, even in a world that one could describe as a G-1, so the world without the United States, you would have a critical mass with institutional backing. This is just not 200 countries trying to come to an agreement. You have the European Union on the one hand and you have ASEAN on the other side. So you have mechanisms for dialogue. Now, what does that mean for businesses? Again, there are a lot of opportunities right now because there will be a reduction in trade barriers. There will be an improvement of bilateral trade relationships with some parts of the world, but it's going to be a different world. First of all, if you are a global company today, that in the past, what is a global company? A global company is a company that is super efficient in managing supply chains globally. You go to the place that is the most efficient for you. Now, in a world where we're seeing blocks, you are losing as a global company one of your biggest advantages, managing these global supply chains. As a matter of fact, we hear a lot about whether European or another ASEAN country or American company, it's China for China, Europe for Europe. But if you're a global company, you're not a global company anymore. You're becoming a Chinese company, you're becoming a European company, and then it's not so clear that you're that much better in competing with the local companies. So managing these regional blocks for global companies will be more costly, but it will happen. So there is no way that we're going to move back to a world that only focuses on efficiency. This resilience ultimately is becoming, I think, a word that most CEOs today have in their back of their minds. Now, what are the benefits of global companies? As we are moving in a world of blocks, you have to replicate systems. We might even talk more about the financial sector side later on, where we're going to have different standards, different technologies. Global companies can absorb these costs. There, the smaller companies have difficulties. You can't do it. But what are the advantage of small and medium companies, small and medium-sized company? Well, they're very agile. They can move more quickly. They can potentially take advantage of a new agreement. So there are opportunities. And maybe the last term that I wanted to highlight is a lot of people talk about de-risking. I think that is completely the wrong term. This is a very risky world. If you want to be successful as a company, you have to take risks, but you have to manage those risks. So de-risking means you stay at home and don't do anything at all. And I think a lot of us here right now, and this is the problem that we're having by having policy uncertainty, investments are not being conducted because we're looking for some certainty coming out of certain parts of the world. In summary, the old order will not return anytime soon. We're increasingly living in blocks, but on the positive side, there are a lot of movements for further integration, and this part of the world has all it takes to be the driver, not only for this part of the world, but for other parts of the world.
Thank you, Alfred. Now, you've heard 6 different versions of the, post last order, the emergence, the search for what is emerging as a new multipolar order. It's not firm yet, but we've had discussions of moving away from Western values. The non-West is asserting itself. I think that is true. They want to be part of the conversation, a central part of the conversation. And I think Western countries should bear that in mind. And who was it who said that the creation of the order, I think it was Ambassador Liu, that there are a few countries that really matter. They are the biggest players, and actually they're the small ones who want to be heard too, but they should be there to help determine and set the next new order. Because we've heard so much from global South countries and BRIC countries that they were not there at the beginning. And the order you have, laid out in the last 80 years, countries did not participate in writing that order. So time to remake it. Gita has brought out inequality, that's good, and I think Alfred has highlighted the economics of things. Now, we've been talking at a 30,000-foot level, and we have an audience of business people who are interested in doing business and business between China, Southeast Asia, rest of the world. So we bear this in mind, and I know Alfred started talking about how business is configuring in the world. Let me come down to something much more concrete, and I think most of you would be interested in. I have a question which I'll take through with the others. But Ryan, do you think a US-China trade deal will be concluded? What will this trade deal look like? But it's not just a trade deal. What happens after the trade deal? I think that's far more important. Does a trade deal, if it is concluded, open new doors and create a new dynamic in US-China relationship? I'll ask Ryan to start, but I'll ask the others to respond.
Well, thank you for the question. I think that if the United States and China conclude a trade deal, many people in the region will breathe a sigh of relief. They will exhale and feel comforted by the fact that the United States and China are still capable of sitting down together, negotiating and resolving issues, as opposed to being on an inexorable path towards confrontation or worse. So that's the first reaction I think that we will feel, particularly here in Singapore. And it would be a good thing if the two leaders were able to come together and reach a deal. My expectation is that it would probably not solve many of the challenges, the core fundamental challenges that exist in the United States relationship with China, nor would it necessarily affect the way that China perceives warily America's intentions towards China and vice versa. So while I understand that there would be a sigh of relief, I would caution against uncorking champagne bottles because I think there will be a lot of work left to do after any deal is announced. And where this goes, just to try to address the second half of your question, I think what we're watching is on the surface, the United States and China are interacting very regularly, intensively. Underneath the surface is where the real action is taking place. China is much more explicit than the United States has been about it, but there is a campaign in both countries towards self-strengthening, hardening, self-reliance, and really trying to insulate and protect against dependence and vulnerability to the other. And I expect that that trend will continue into the foreseeable future.
Thank you. Now, Professor Liu, you're an economist. I want to ask you, do you think this deal will be concluded from the Chinese point of view? And, it has been said observed by, in fact, American scholars that China enters into negotiations very quickly, but it concludes a deal very slowly. And you really want to keep the United States in the negotiating process because that is stabilizing. Do you agree with that? Do you think there'll be a deal? And are you positive about the trends of US-China relations?
好，协议肯定是会达成的，因为两个大国在过去这10年的这一个冲突中间。已经认识到很多东西，比如说第一个，完全脱钩是不可能的，相互都需要，不仅仅是市场，不仅仅是相关的一些技术、教育各方面的一些合作，但是大家也认识到，的确在新的体系里面，大家存在着一些实质性的冲突。所以我认为，就是说，目前来看，特别是从前3轮的这一个贸易谈判的这一个状况来看，第一，我们可能会在一般的这种正常的交往和商品中间，会采取相互妥协，达成一致的协定。那么第二，就是在一些大家认可的一些具有实质性冲突。特别是美国认为要在一些技术层面、高端层面要进行遏制中国的这上面，那么的确可能会采取相对脱钩和对抗的这样的一种体系。当然，我认为还有第3个层面，也就是大家放置一些争议，采取一些模糊的一些态度。随着未来的一些时间的一些变化，再来处理的一些领域。所以，因此我认为，就是说，这里面既有合作，既有对抗，也有模糊，那么形成这样的一个状态。因为我认为，就是说，大国之间的这种关系，它一定是一个时代和中期的一种重构，那么它需要一个中期视角来进行。妥善的一些处理，而不是简单的某一种利益、某一种价值观来简单的主导最终的这种结果的。
Thank you. Kwon Ping, I just want to hear from you a Southeast Asian point of view. If there is a deal between the United States and China on a trade deal, how do you think it will affect Southeast Asia? And how would Southeast Asian companies and businesses respond?
Well, first of all, as a betting man, I will bet with you that there will be a deal because of TACO. Because at the end of the day, China holds the cards, Trump makes all the noise. We've seen enough cases where he would chicken out. So I think there will be a deal. And I'll bet anybody on this. I think the impact, though, is that we in Southeast Asia are basically on the sidelines. The net positive, if there's a deal, simply is that we will not be flooded by a lot of cheap exports from China to the rest of the global south because of the overcapacity in China today. If China is not able to find part of its export markets in the US, the overcapacity is going to spill out to flooding countries where Southeast Asian exports would have gone to. So we will breathe a sigh of relief in that respect. But I think no matter what happens, the more savvy business people in ASEAN, whether you're trading in goods or services, as we are with tourism, the lesson learned is the typical saying that when two elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. And I think that is truly a lesson here. We have to diversify out of the US market and out of China market, where because China is so close to us, China was such a big market for so many Southeast Asian economies. The lesson learned is that this whole trade war between US and China and the whole rivalry is not going to go away so easily, and we need to urgently diversify. Now, that actually has been happening. The private sector, without being urged by governments and so on, the global share of world trade that the US has been having has been declining over the last 20 to 30 years, mainly because of the economic rise of the global south. There's been a lot of talk about ASEAN intertrade, but exactly as mentioned by Gita, that the income inequality is still very massive. So there's a lot of talk about ASEAN exporting to each other. We are a bloc of 600 million people, and that is beginning to change. There will be more attempts to trade within ASEAN itself, and hopefully that will lead to a rising tide within ASEAN. But the biggest lesson learned, I think, and the biggest benefit to ASEAN, if there is a China-US trade deal, is that we'll be temporarily spared the negative outcome if there's no trade deal. But we must use that time that we gain to diversify our markets, because otherwise the temporary gain of a China-US trade deal will be lost on us.
Thank you, Kwon Ping. Gosh, I'm running out of time. I want to comment, but I will not, because I want to go on to the de-dollarization question, which I think there's great interest in, And let me sort of ask this. Is this a growing trend? Is it gaining traction with Global South? The SCO meeting in Tianjin, I think the subtext was also de-dollarization, Do you think this will continue? And is there a pushback against de-dollarization? I'll start with Alfred first and work backwards here.
Thank you very much. I think that's one of the most important questions. We are focused very much on trade, and we see a diversion of trade flows. Southeast Asia is benefiting a lot. We focus on investment, and again, it kind of follows the trade route. Southeast Asia has benefited a lot from this, but I think the real question is about what I call the financial plumbing. That includes the de-dollarization or dollarization, and the development of systems, what we call payment systems, that use different technologies, and there, in my view, we're moving toward a further fragmentation. But I think we have two major trends right now. One is because of the US's embrace of crypto and stablecoin, the Genius Act. There's actually currently a global development toward dollarization. Some countries especially ones that have weaker macroeconomic fundamentals, people are trying to use stable coins linked to the US dollar. On the other hand, though, we have massive forces because of the potential risks that can come when you rely too much on the US dollar to de-dollarize. And that is true for China, obviously. Is also true for Europe. Christine Lagarde the other day came out, ECB president said, this is the time that we need to push for the euro because ultimately we want to be somewhat independent. And China, of course, is now actively using it in the context of opening up via Hong Kong, encouraging the internationalization of the RMB. But the point that I wanted to make is that this fragmentation of the financial plumbing will go ahead. We have different systems. Europe is adopting one. China has a system, and there will be some other countries that will probably adopt that as well. It's called mBridge. Then we got an Indian system, another system, and ultimately the US will probably rely on stablecoin. Each of them uses different technologies, and ultimately they won't be talking to each other. So I think from a business point of view, you have to be ready to deal with different systems simultaneously, but that I think you won't be able to put back in the bag because ultimately countries want to ring fence their financial system and reduce vulnerabilities and the reliance on the US dollar.
Thank you. Does anyone want to comment on this?
Well, maybe as a business practitioner,
Yeah.
I would say that I would totally agree, but I think it's not so much de-dollarization. I think the US dollar is so entrenched, it's going to be a very long time before you de-dollarize. But I think there's clearly a trend towards greater diversification away from purely using the US dollar. But a lot of those will be more G2G deals. You see a lot of that in G2G deals. But as a business practitioner, I've seen, because we work in 20 over countries, we deal with quite a number of sanctioned companies and others also. So I see it firsthand that I think what alarmed most companies around the world and countries is not so much the ideological idea of de-dollarizing. It was what happened with SWIFT, the weaponization of the payment system to really affect so many companies and countries. And that has led to the phenomenon now of alternative payment systems, including digital. Certainly there's a big difference between various kinds of cryptocurrencies, but stablecoin and digital payment systems by which it is going to be much harder to weaponize the payment system. I think that has really accelerated, and that's happening. We deal with so many countries and companies now that basically want to use a different payment system, but still in US dollars.
Professor Liu, just 1 minute.
那么去美元化不是今天才讨论的，那么导致大家讨论这个议题核心的第一个原因是美国债务风险以及美国主权地位。第二个很重要的就是在经济多元化、多极化过程中间，各个国家对于经济主权的诉求，那么导致支付多元化。当然，第三个很重要，就是地缘政治本身导致的风险，是大家一定要采取美国+1的这样的一种投资战略。所以这是三个很重要的维度，也是我们思考的维度。当然，如果从过去美元体系历史来看，我们已经会看到，第一个很重要的时刻就是布雷顿森林体系的建立。那么美元确定了全球基础货币的地位。那么1945年，第二个很重要就是1971年尼克松冲击，实际上美国进行了调整，美元与黄金脱钩。那么当然，现在又到了一个很重要的节点，也就是美国对于数字金融、数字货币所出台的3大法案。那么这3大法案允许美元稳定币的这种全面实施 全面推进。那么这个大家认为它是怎么样？数字版本的布雷顿森林体系。那么从数字货币的角度、稳定货币的角度，全面进一步延伸美元在全球体系的这种渗透和它的稳定性，从而缓解美国的这一个美元地位以及美国债务所呈现的这种风险。那么这里面肯定会产生一些格局性的变化，但是回归到我们刚才讲的3大因素，会不会有根本性的变化？这是我们可能思考去美元很重要的3个维度、2个阶段的一个视角。我就补充这一点，谢谢。
Thank you very much, Professor Liu. Now, I want to move away from security, from economics, and come to something that really impacts on all our lives, is the warming planet. And because we have Ambassador Liu here, who is the climate envoy for China to, climate change envoy. Ambassador Liu, my question to you is this. Now that the United States has pulled out of the Paris Agreement and funding is also cut, do you think, the rest of us will be able to push ahead better, faster? Where will the funding come from? Because less developed countries, many of the global south countries, really need funding to switch to more sustainable energy and to develop building materials, etc. Would you care to answer that? Will philanthropy be able to make up?
Thank you. I think this is a very, very, very pertinent question before the COP30, forthcoming COP30 to be convened in November in Brazil. Definitely, I think it's a tragedy for the world, for the global climate process, to witness, to see the U.S. withdraw from the Paris Agreement for the second time. But I think this withdrawal from the Paris Agreement for the second time is the more damaging. It'd be President Trump has abolished all his climate teams in all the departments. That we are discussing with our host country of COP30 and other partners. We are going to see a first COP that be without U.S. engagement, without U.S. participation. That's a pity. But I think that for the world, for the rest of the countries, I think that of course they are all determined to ensure this COP process, global climate process will move forward irrespective of withdrawal of one country or the other. I think that of course. So global process will continue. It's a global energy transition process that will irreversible, will continue. Because this global transition, energy transition process is driven not just by the political will, but also by the market, by the technology. Because I think the clean and green technology, like the solar and wind technology, they become much cheaper than coal and oil. And they become much safe for some countries. So I think this will continue. Of course, the damaging of the U.S. will be the suspension of the financial support to the global south. And as well as its impact on the mentality of the European Union. The challenging for the developing south that not in the U.S., Europeans, they are gradually shifting their financial investment to the domestic economy, to supporting the Ukrainian war, to investments in artificial intelligence and others. They are also reducing their support. So the challenging in the next few years that for the international community, we need to move different sources of financial support to the global south. I think if we stop supporting developing countries, stop the global transition, then we are going to miss opportunity. The risk that be global cost or price of the transition will go up. I think it's better to know than waiting for another 5 years. Thank you.
Can I give a business?
There are two, Gita and this. And you know, I've been a terrible moderator because we are coming to the end of the session and I haven't had time to let you ask questions. It's all the conversation is here. But Gita?
I'm happy to pick up on what the ambassador alluded to. And I want to put the climate topic in the context of Southeast Asia. And I don't want to be known as the inequality guy. But energy is another form of inequality. If we take a look at the electrification of Southeast Asia, there's only 2 countries that are at the top of the hill. These are Singapore and Brunei that are electrified at about 10,000 kilowatt hour per capita. Malaysia is the next best at 5,000 kilowatt hour per capita. Then you've got Indonesia at 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita, which is the same as that of India. Now, the first base camp for modernity is at 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita. If we were to bring up all the other 8 countries of Southeast Asia beyond Brunei and Singapore to that level of 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita, Southeast Asia would need to build 1 additional terawatt worth of power generation capabilities in addition to the pre-existing 400,000 megawatts. How much would it cost? Depends on whether or not you want to use renewable energy. If you want to use coal, it's going to be cheaper. But if you want to use renewable energy, it's going to cost between $2 to $3 trillion. Southeast Asia does not have that kind of economic space. Given the low tax ratios ranging from 10% to 16%, given the low monetary spaces for most large countries in Southeast Asia, Indonesia has a money supply to GDP ratio of only 45%. A developed economy runs at a ratio of higher than 200%. So the only way out is through FDI, or foreign direct investment. But here's the kink. FDI that comes to Southeast Asia on a yearly basis is about $200 to $230 billion, of which Singapore gets about 100 to 140 billion. Indonesia gets about 30 to 40 billion. Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, and the Philippines each gets about 10 to 20 billion, most of which is not allocated for energy. So just using Indonesia as an instance, it builds about 3,000 to 5,000 megawatts worth of power generation capabilities per year. In order for Indonesia to go up from 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita to 6,000, if it builds only 3,000 per year, Indonesia will need 120 years to attain modernity, which is completely irreconcilable with the rhetoric of sustainability that's supposed to attain carbon neutrality by 2050 or even 2060. So I think the narrative of sustainability for the Global South, inclusive of most members of Southeast Asia, will need to be injected with not ideology, but with realism. There needs to be realism, and the only way out is to attain economic capital and technological capital. I do believe that China is going to be the most logical technological capital allocator, secondarily economic capital allocator, because China is preeminent in being able to bring down that cost of renewable energy at about 15 cents per kilowatt hour to 14, 13, 12, and thereafter faster, sooner than anybody else. Whereas the Global South purchasing power is at 5 cents per kilowatt hour. My time is up.
Yeah. It was up long ago. Now, can you say it in 10 seconds?
Very fast. As the only businessman on this panel, I would say in the last 2-3 years, businessmen I know have rapidly given up on all multilateral talks about climate mitigation, and we are all moving very rapidly, including my company, to climate adaptation. We're no longer talking about carbon offsets, planting trees. We are ourselves looking at what climate change is going to do to us, because we're way past governments talking, and we now are basically looking at how to protect our own companies and our own businesses against this inevitable climate change that is happening. We have given up on COP, we have given up on governments, we are now simply protecting our own companies. That's what is a business perspective.
Thank you. Well, you know, I can't summarize what has been said. A lot has been said, but I hope you have found the discussion this morning very useful, and I'm sorry I didn't give you time to ask your questions, but there we are. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we can...